Thanks for joining us Behind the Frontline, a video podcast providing timeless solutions to everyday workforce and workplace challenges. Frontline Training Solutions is an express employment professionals company, strategically placed between the workplace and the workforce with professionals standing by, ready to combat your unique challenges. Learn more about what we do at frontlineon.com. Welcome again to another episode of Behind the Frontline, a solutions-focused podcast from Frontline Training Solutions. And today, I'm sitting here with Nathan Leaman and Lorraine Medici. And Lorraine is the Director of Training and Development here for Frontline. And Nathan is our Managing Director. And of course, I'm Nic, the Creative Director here. And today we're having a conversation around having conversations.
Oh, yeah. I like what you did there.
Right?
Yeah,
you like what I did there?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a few weeks ago, we did a webinar on navigating difficult conversations. If you want to watch that, it's very insightful. It's on our website. But we received a lot of questions from that we wanted to follow up on. And so today is going to be a new conversation. We're going to hash out some of those questions and answers that we received, but also carry this conversation a little deeper.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's important. For sure. There's so much interest.
Oh my goodness. One of our biggest attended webinars ever. And I think we just hit a nerve. There's so much need for this. So happy to continue the conversation today.
Yeah. All right. So coming out of the webinar, seeing some of these questions, what are your first insights?
Well, I'll start by just saying there's a lot of questions and a lot of specific scenarios. I think sometimes with our webinars, we get kind of the broader, generalized questions, but the things we'll work through in this discussion today and some of what we know already emerged, there's some very specific things like, how do I handle this situation?
Right.
And I think a possible theme from our conversation, because I'm not exactly sure where it's all going to go, but is the application of some of the tools we talked about really can work broadly. You don't have to have a specific solution to address every specific challenging conversation. There's some principles and some tools that we would certainly encourage people to go back and watch the webinar if you haven't seen it. But if you did, we're going to get back to some of these things and just continue to talk about applying them and being consistent, because getting good at those will help you navigate a lot of specifics much more broadly than the ones that we've experienced or the questions we've gotten already.
Yeah. What are your thoughts as far as when you'd like to maybe review the SBI model?
Yeah.
Dialing in. I don't know if that's something we want to talk about.
Well, that's one of the models, right? That's one of the core models. And I think it's one we need people to really start wrapping their minds around, because I think one of the common things that came through was, what if it's my boss? Or what if it's this situation? Or what if it's that situation? And the SBI, Situation Behavior Impact model, is something that can be broadly applied quite well.
Yeah. And that's something we can offer through Frontline, right?
Yeah, we definitely use that tool in many of our training classes.
Do you want to explain a little bit in more detail what that is, just for our audience?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So situation behavior impact is a way to try to take the emotion out of the challenging conversation. And we spent some time talking about and thinking about the emotions we're experiencing, the emotions the other person is likely experiencing. But the situation behavior impact is a model that says, start with describing what was happening and keep it as objective as possible. So a good example, and I'm not exactly sure if this is the one we used in the webinar or not, but let's just say somebody's not paying attention in meetings, for instance. They're being distracting. Maybe they're on their phone or whatever. So the situation part of that is, in our meeting, in our staff meeting last week, that's the situation. It takes me immediately back to that spot. The B stands for behavior. So in this meeting last week situation, you were on your phone 90% of the time. It's the behavior. And again, trying to keep it pretty objective.
But also observable.
Observable and something they can remember, right? And so it is definitely something that they should be able to recall. And the impact is what I stands for. So in our meeting last week, you were on your phone 90% of the time. And unfortunately, we didn't hear your thoughts related to these 3 topics. That's the impact.
Yeah.
Okay. What sometimes we do is we go right to our own understanding of why they are doing what they're doing. Like, you clearly didn't care about the topics that we were talking about. You were totally checked out.
Yeah.
You were not being a good team player. These are all like motive and accusations.
And a lot of judgments.
And judgment, full of judgment, instead of stick with the facts.
Yeah.
When you stick with the facts, it takes that emotion out of it a little bit. You don't know why they were on their phone. Maybe there was an emergency at home. Maybe they're really dealing with some stuff or whatever. It doesn't change the fact that there was an impact to that.
Sure.
So let's just name where we were, what was happening, what the person was doing, and the impact of it. And then really invite them into the conversation at that point.
Right.
Like, help me understand what was going on. Does this resonate with you or what? Just get them into the conversation at that point. You've basically said your feedback piece.
Yeah.
You've basically got it out there, and you did it in a non-judgmental way. Trying to keep it as objective as possible, I think, is where SBI can be really, really helpful, versus sometimes where we go, because we get hijacked, our emotions are all over the place.
Exactly.
And we start to jump in with some more accusatory type things, which shuts the conversation down and puts them on the defensive, which we don't want to do.
Right. Yeah. When navigating a conversation like that, and I know we'll dive into these questions a little bit more, but I'm thinking through that model, and you said, emotions can get hijacked. So let's talk maybe for a second about the importance of like emotional intelligence training for leaders when it comes to having conversations like this, not just for your own professional development, but, also developing the team. And when you have to have this conversation, because it's easy for our emotions to get hijacked. Something I always said was, you approach conversations, one of two ways, either with a bucket of water or a bucket of gas. And the outcome can really depend on how you approach it and what you can do with that.
That's very good.
So maybe let's talk for a second about the importance of emotional intelligence in leadership.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's something we spend a lot of time in our leadership programs, whether it's purpose-driven leadership training or our foundations of emotional intelligence. And then we also have an advanced class. And exactly for what you said, right, in that example, Nate, is that if somebody responds to you and like either shuts down or goes, what are you talking about? I mean, I was listening just because I was on my phone, and they're obviously triggered, right? You can match that trigger, right? And so learning and understanding key concepts, like when somebody is receiving feedback, let's face it, it's not comfortable. You're a bit in the hot seat. Having a defensiveness can be normal. And I think what you have to do is understand, I don't need to match where they're at. I really need, there's another model, above the line, below the line, to just stay above that line and be more of the coach and say, I can see you're frustrated. I can see you're feeling a bit defensive in this. And so you're almost normalizing what they're feeling, not reacting to how they're reacting. So emotional intelligence for leaders especially is so critical, and it can change the impact of these challenging conversations.
Yeah, you have to interrupt autopilot, right?
Yeah.
And reaction is where we go when we just stay in the zone of our autopilot. We let that trigger push
Take
us
over, yeah.
right? Whereas we're actually saying, no, we need to do something or have some way to interrupt that automatic response.
Right.
So we could go into more of a purposeful response. One of the tools that I've used over the years to try to do that, and it's a hard discipline, because especially if you're feeling defensive or feeling like, boy, I don't know if that feedback was fair, has been to simply say thank you for the feedback.
Exactly.
And if you're not emotionally able to respond well in the moment, leave it at that. You can revisit it later when the emotions die down. But why this is so important for leaders especially is they set the tone for the kinds of conversations that happen on their teams. And if a leader doesn't respond well to feedback that's critical and hard, nobody's going to respond well to feedback that's critical and hard on their team. And so if you're not able to engage in a really healthy dialogue and conversation at that moment and really listen to and understand what they're telling you, then say thank you for the feedback and let it go for that moment. And let me tell you, that's very hard. And if not done right, it can actually come across like you're dismissing it, like, well, thanks for the feedback kind of thing, right?
That's
So
true.
you have to do it in a really emotionally intelligent way too, that helps them understand that you've heard it. And even if you need to say, I'm probably not at the right place to talk about this right now, but I do think it's something we should circle back on at a later time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thank you, just real quick here, Nic, the thank you too is, as the leader, is to also thank the person who's receiving the feedback. You know, thank you. Even if they don't behave stellar to receiving feedback, to say thank you for being here. I understand this is hard. It's not comfortable. And I appreciate at least getting into some conversation. And I think that's extending some empathy for what's going on in the situation. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on empathy because I want to circle back around to that. But I have received feedback before, and I've felt that where it's like I can't really talk about this right now. We need to circle back. But I also think it depends on the motivation behind the feedback as well. Like if someone is approaching this from a personal stance, or if someone's approaching the feedback from a professional stance, where I've received feedback that was obviously personally motivated and I didn't quite agree with it. So I was like, well, I need to think about this. We need to circle back around to this and talk about this. But I've also received feedback that is professionally focused, and I'm able to say, okay, I thank you for that. Let's talk about this more in depth.
Yeah, which is really where the SBI, I think, comes in. SBI keeps it more professional.
Yeah.
You've structured it a certain way. And one of the things we talked about in the webinar was take time to prepare for that conversation. Don't do it off the cuff, you know?
Yeah.
Especially the higher level of emotions that are likely to come out of it. That means you need to have a proportional amount of time in preparing, right? So think about that intentionally. Put together your, type it out.
Yeah.
Type it out and read it out loud. Find a trusted advisor, partner, mentor, coach, somebody that you can go to and say, hey, I got to have this difficult conversation. This is how I'm thinking about framing it up. I mean, too often what we do is we go into those, one, having not prepared, or we're doing it in a reactionary way.
Yeah.
Neither one of those is probably going to end up in a good spot, even if you have the best intentions and even if you try to use the SBI approach. It's probably not going to go well.
You know, one of the questions that we got is actually in realm with this. How long would you say is appropriate to take a break if emotions are running high?
Yeah. I think no more than 24 to 48 hours, because you don't want to lose that momentum and the seriousness of the situation. It can't be one of those things, well, we'll come back around and talk about this next week, because you may lose a great deal.
A lot can happen in a week, especially manufacturing world.
We'll come back when I'm comfortable with the topic, because that's never going to happen.
That's right. That's right.
When it's better. No,
but
it's never going to be comfortable.
Exactly. So kind of having that opportunity to de-escalate, and usually for most people, most of us can kind of get into a little bit of better headspace and go into it. I wanted to just come back around, Nate, to something that you said about preparation, because we talked about this in the webinar, and that is sometimes in class, people will say, well, does that look really very professional to have something prepared, or, I have your notes? And I'm like, absolutely. And one of the ways I kind of say to people is I have prepared ahead of time to make sure that I'm staying on topic, that we're addressing the specifics of why we are here, and to really stay in the lane. And I think it serves two purposes. Number one, we really do stay in the lane, right? When people want to start deflecting and going in different places, it's a great way to come back. But I think it also honors time, so that we are continually staying on that, especially if you're going to use that SBI model approach. And it's not to get every question, because obviously we're going to have a lot of organic questions and statements, but if I had to have this question, there was maybe, 3 to 5, I really want some answers on these.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. And it's, you can ask yourself the question, like, would you prefer to get feedback from somebody who's been thoughtful, prepared, wrote it out, put an outline together, was intentional, or someone who felt like, oh, I can't have anything in front of me, I have to wing it, or try to remember what I'm supposed to say? I think most of us are going to want the feedback from the first person, the one that's prepared, and it's okay to have notes.
Yeah.
And I think it also helps them understand that there's a boundary to this conversation. This is what it's not going to just go anywhere.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes what happens, right? We start with one thing and then we end up in 4 other, and this, and
and did you know,
exactly.
What about this person?
Never
doing
ends,
and,
right? And so it can really help them understand that this is a structured conversation, but that you've been thoughtful about it.
Yeah.
Obviously, the SBI model is very effective for difficult conversations, but would you say the same applies to giving positive feedback?
100%. And it helps you be very specific so that it's not just, hey, great job yesterday.
Yeah.
We're like, with what? So you could even take my scenario from before and flip it and say, hey, in the meeting last week, you were really engaged. You provided a lot of really insightful information. When you brought up that one chart on whatever, that really helped people see a perspective they hadn't seen before. Thank you so much for doing that. So impactful. Situation, behavior, impact. It was all there.
Exactly.
And it can be used equally on the positive side for sure.
Good question, Nic. That's really good to use that in the reverse way.
Yeah.
It's as important to give that kind of feedback as it is when you have to deal with challenging situations, right? Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we're not talking about positive
Conversations, right?
We're talking about difficult ones. So let's say emotions are rising. At what point is it appropriate to pull in another person into the conversation, whether it be HR or another leader? What would you say?
Well, I'll offer maybe a couple of thoughts. If the conversation is like circling the drain over and over and over again, like we don't seem to be making progress, there's no real awareness there, or people just are rehashing the same thing over and over again, that could be a sign. I'm not saying always that that's a sign, but that could be a sign. Pay attention to your emotions too. You even if you go in with the best of intentions and you keep calm at first, if you feel that emotions rising, if you feel like you start to get hijacked and triggered and it starts to now go into a lot of different things, that could be a time when you need to ask for help. If there's if it's a legal issue, if there's potentially a risk involved, obviously you're going to want to include human resources or other resources inside the organization. I think most leaders of companies who spend time thinking about risk would say, if in doubt, bring someone else in. Like, it's okay. Be proactive in that. Don't feel like you have to have some amazing equation that says, okay, this magically means we need to bring someone else in. Yeah. If you need help, if you're a little doubtful, you're not sure where this is going, it doesn't feel healthy, all of those are signs. Pay attention and don't be afraid to bring in help. Yeah.
And I'd say the only caveat maybe to that, again, is not to think of bringing in somebody to make you feel more comfortable, right? Outside of a risky situation, okay, let's just say it's not risky, but it may involve some heated emotions, some passionate emotions. If I'm like, oh boy, I'm thinking, Nic's going to get really, really heated here. I better grab, Nate in here. Yeah, am I doing that because I'm going to feel more comfortable having Nate in there, as opposed to going, let's start this way, right? But I think you're right. Discerning that risk.
What do you think? That's a really interesting point, Lorraine. What do you think is the potential downside of pulling people in? Because I could imagine some people would be saying, well, maybe this is how I learn. Like, pull someone in that's better at it than me, right? And maybe I need a mentor. Maybe I need somebody to show me. Maybe I need to have some support to get through the first couple or whatever. So what's the downside, do you think, that we need to be mindful of if we're defaulting to maybe saying, oh, I got to bring someone else in to help me?
Yeah. Well, I think the obvious one and that comes to mind is that the person who's receiving the feedback could feel attacked, kind of be kind of
2-on-1.
yeah, and I'm looking at four eyes, and I'm starting to feel more nervous, and I'm shutting down maybe, or I'm escalating higher, and I'm not feeling like this is we're on unequal grounding. That's why I think we would all agree that the best way to start is first bringing it to that person. So I think that would be number one. I hear what you're saying about, having somebody who could maybe mentor that. I just wonder.
Like mediator?
Yeah, I just would be careful, jump. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, no, I liked your first response. Definitely, like, hey, it could feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
2-on-1. I think this is where role playing comes in.
Yeah.
So the comfort you're getting is from somebody that quote unquote does it better than you potentially, and you don't have to be the one. Well, can you do a role play thing instead of bringing them into the conversation? Use them to help you navigate it.
Right.
The long-term risk is that you don't get good at it, that you don't have practice, you don't have some at-bats at having these difficult conversations, and we fall into the habit of just pulling someone else in because we don't want to deal with it.
Right. It's more comfortable, to against one. The other thing too is it may not go wonderful, but it probably will go better than if you had not role played. And I think you have the opportunity to actually reflect afterwards with that person. They go, hey, this is what happened. I felt really confident on here, and then a little bit fuzzy on here, not so strong, or didn't see those skills come out. What would you have done differently, right? So I'm using you to kind of help me reflect and go back. But I think I love that. Role play first a few times, and I really think you're going to do better than you would have if you would have never done it. Right. So.
Yeah. Let's flip the script for a second, and let's talk about leading up. Let's say you need to give feedback to your boss, or you need to have that conversation with your leader. Because we know from our own statistics that 57% of people actually leave a job due to a bad boss, and 82% are considering it.
Yeah.
It's a huge number of people.
Yeah.
And so how easy or how much better would it be if someone knew how to navigate that conversation with a bad leader? So what would you say in flipping the script? Is it the same process, or would you say employees need to approach it differently?
I think it's definitely idealistic, but I think it's right to say that the process is the same. The situation behavior impact model works in that scenario as well. There are power dynamics at play in organizations when it's an individual talking to their manager, for sure. There's cultural dynamics. How acceptable is this? Is this a reasonable expectation? There's how much trust is in the system?
Yeah, I was just going to mention
between the individual and the leader. What has the leader done in the past to help people feel open or closed to doing this kind of thing? And I get all of that is real. I do think, again, the situation behavior impact approach takes it out of the emotional as much as possible and into the objective, and stick with the facts. If the individual, the only caveat I would say is if the manager or leader is belligerent or reacts very strongly and harshly against it, there may be an opportunity where you need to have the courage to pull other people in, especially if it's like materially impacting you, your ability to work, your feelings of safety and ability to have an engaged experience, whatever the case may be. We may need to pull in others to help with that.
Wouldn't you agree, though, that it would still be best to try to have that initial conversation?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%. Use the SBI. Try it first.
Yeah.
Now, there are people probably listening to this like, it would never work.
Of course.
Never work, right? And there's a lot of fear, potentially, that they're dealing with. And I get that. I just don't know of a better model than that one.
Yeah. Well, it's so simple. It really, the idea I think that we try to do a lot is not come up with something heavy, academic, philosophical thing that the average person can't just incorporate into their personal and professional life. It's got to be realistic, it's got to make sense, and it's got to be easy to do.
Not the here's your 80 steps to navigating
how to manage up, right? And I even think things like if I think about and I have done this in the past before, where I've said this is really difficult for me, or I might say I'm a little bit nervous. I'm struggling here. So I think by opening up the conversation before I actually get into the SBI, by being vulnerable to say that, can sometimes maybe de-escalate that leader to a point that they're more open to hear.
Yeah. It's a very emotionally intelligent way to do it.
Yeah.
Kind of understand, what am I experiencing and feeling, and naming it. Yeah. I think helps them understand your frame of reference and mind.
Exactly. And where you're coming from. Another way to do it, sometimes we talk a lot about our corporate values, right? Do people understand what their corporate values are? And it's such an easy go-to to say, one of our corporate values is professionalism, let's say. And I'm coming from that lens right now. Here's what I saw, and I'm struggling with that. And I wanted to give you some of that feedback. Here's what here's what it is. Here's what I saw, and this is how it impacted the situation.
Yeah, that's really good.
It's really good. Yeah. Earlier you mentioned empathy. I was wondering if you could just kind of dig a little deeper into that, and then the need for employers or, employees to have a sense of empathy when approaching or receiving these conversations.
Yeah. Well, we talk a lot about empathy in our developing coaching leaders class, is that we first have to understand that we have to get to some point where, tell me when you've been on that hot seat. What did that feel like? I mean, we got to almost, do recall. What did that feel like? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? What did you want to do right then? Right. So empathy, I think, is an interesting emotion, because I think people have the sense that you have to agree with what they're feeling. And you don't have to agree with it. It's more about coming to understand from their point of view, from their lens. This is how they're seeing it. And you being able to then go, yeah, from your point of view, it makes sense you would feel that way. I can see why you feel frustrated that you and Jane are not working well on this project. So by kind of normalizing, giving some acceptance to some of those feelings, I think people feel heard.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. And, empathy ultimately is about, understanding where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to somebody yesterday about this whole issue of feedback, and we went through the situation behavior impact, and the question kind of came up with, well, what if it's a situation where I need to have the conversation, but it's not highly charged, not highly emotional. The example that was given was, I was with my direct report, and they were giving a presentation to the team, and there were some obvious things that probably could have been done better. Typo in one of the slides, the animation wasn't quite right, and in one of the transitions, they didn't necessarily catch on the fact that some people in the audience had questions, even though they were kind of raising their hand a little bit. And so I'm sitting and observing, and this is what the person is saying. I don't want to jump in right in the middle of the meeting, because that could be really embarrassing. And so we were talking about, well, what do you do in that situation where it's that kind of a thing? It wasn't the end of the world by any means. They did largely a good job. But you still want to make sure that they dial into maybe that professionalism like you were talking. So we talked about another approach, which is really, how can we get those individuals to get their ideas out first before I launch into my situation behavior impact or my feedback? And there are 3 questions. This really comes from an organization called Inside Out Development. They've got a great class called Inside Out Coaching. There's a book called You Already Know How to Be Great that they've put out there. It's really, really awesome model. But they have these 3 questions: what worked? Where are you stuck? What would you do differently?
Yeah.
Kind of like a SWOT analysis.
Yeah. Very, very quick conversation, right? And so the idea here is, what if you started with some questions for that with that person?
Exactly.
What do you think went well in that presentation?
Yeah.
Well, I think the content was right, and filled the right amount of time, and I felt really prepared. Where did you get stuck? Well, that one transition didn't work so good. And I did notice there was a typo on one of the slides, right? What would you do differently? Well, I think I'd spend a little bit more time making sure the slides are right, and dial that in a little bit more, and make sure that everything runs really smoothly. Okay, what has happened? They basically gave themselves almost all the feedback that you wanted to give them. There's a chance in these kind of conversations, maybe again, when the emotions aren't super high or whatever, they may already know a lot of what they need to improve on.
Sure.
So how do you as a leader potentially draw that out and let them download a little bit? And then, you know what? The only thing you might have to say is, I agree with everything you said. First of all, I do think it went really well. I noticed a couple of those things too. There was also one typo on slide 5. Oh yeah, I didn't know that. I need to go back and look.
Yeah.
Right. So they may not even have awareness of it. Right.
Right.
And so it's a matter. And Nate's approach right there is such a great example of using coaching questions, which is really becoming more of a conversation than a monologue.
That's right.
Telling you.
That's right. And if they can unload a lot of the feedback themselves, that saves you from having to do it.
Yeah.
Right. But it's also better because they're the ones articulating. Doesn't mean that you don't lean into the feedback you still need to provide.
Right.
Maybe you use situation, behavior, impact, or maybe you just say it like I said, oh yeah, there was one typo or whatever. But instead of having to give 7 or 8 points, you had to give 1.
Right.
Because you knew they already got the other 6.
And I think even the long goal in all of this helps them start to get more comfortable around being better at self-reliance and self-reflection and thinking things through, as opposed to just being more of that passive, hey, Nate, let me tell you, you started off pretty good. And it was like slide 3 and 6, there was some great, and you're just going, oh, okay, all right, thank you. So you're inviting them into the conversation, you're engaging them to think through those. And that's something I constantly hear, is that people don't think anymore on their own. And I think it's because we've done such a disservice over the years of being kind of that telling and yelling. I actually was coaching somebody the other day who said, how come I don't feel as happy when I'm asking some of these good open-ended questions? I feel more energized when I can just tell people, you did this wrong, you got to do this differently. And I think I shared that with you yesterday. And it's that quick, immediate gratification that you get. But then later on, it's that sense of, I feel really bad that I did it that way.
Yeah, well, and you're training that individual that's how it's going to be. And so you better be able to do that every time. So you're delegating to your future leadership self when you start to lean into that versus the self-reliant problem solving, asking questions to get people engaged. That's going to be a more sustainable long-term approach than doing it the other way. I got to come in with all the answers.
Right.
Tell them what to do.
So I want to dive a little bit deeper into the steps of coaching in terms of asking open-ended questions and acknowledging, but also with listening with empathy. Have you seen that video that went around the internet maybe 8 years ago? It's not about the nail.
Oh yeah. We show that. We should show that.
I show it right now.
Okay, let's do it.
We'll watch this and then discuss this, because I feel like it kind of fits what we're talking about.
It's just, there's all this pressure, and sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless, and I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't...
Now,
All
obviously,
those sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them. That's my favorite.
I know.
I love that.
So good.
So when you resolve the problem, obviously don't kiss your employee.
That's right.
Correct.
But I feel like that situation kind of applies to what we're talking about. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. There are times where people definitely do need us just to listen and understand and empathize. A lot of leaders, and actually just even if you're not a leader and somebody just comes to you with a problem, you know, we're so wired to fix the problem or look for the solution, and we think it's clear on our end and all that. But what they need in that moment is a different style of leadership and support. You still need to get to the issue at some point, but they may shut down if that's exactly where you go at first.
Well, and I was Dana, one of our teammates, was showing. I love this very, very simple model. If I can just share this really quickly, is that on an average day, we have this beautiful balance when we have this of logic and emotions, right? We're kind of walking through our day and we don't have big dips and valleys. And then we have moments maybe in our days where all of a sudden our emotions just, right? And hijack us. And so now that bubble is no longer 50-50, right? It's all emotions. And we, like you said, we are wired to want to come from a well-meaning place to go, it's right there, right? He so desperately, he sees it and she doesn't, right? And so what we want to do is stuff logic and understanding into that. And a lot of times they're like, yeah, that's not helping me. And so all this good information is bouncing back, just like he's trying to do this with her. It's boomeranging out of the way. And come to understand is that there is no room in that bubble for logic at that time. And so there needs to be this release of just, you listen, let me just vent for a minute, so that we get to our third bubble where now there's a little bit more room for logic with some of those emotions, but it's not that intensity. And I just think that visual is so helpful, that even though it's so obviously crystal clear, if the other person doesn't see it, it doesn't matter what you say.
Right. Yeah, so I'm reminded of a quote by Alan Fine, who wrote that book, You Already Know How to Be Great. He says, it's not that people don't know what to do. It's that they don't do what they know.
Yeah.
And the reason they don't do what they know is something is interfering.
Yeah.
Something's in the way. It could be emotions. There's another book that I would highly recommend. It's a little bit more academic, called Immunity to Change. 2 Harvard professors wrote this book, and it's built on the premise that people who really, really need to change, whatever the thing might be, there's something going on that's preventing them. It's like they literally have their foot on the gas and the brake at the same time. And they use the illustration at the beginning of the book. They said 7 out of 10 people who are told if they don't stop smoking, they will die, don't stop smoking. So it's not an issue of the stakes could not be any higher, right? But there's something that's preventing them. You know, they're not smoking. You know, the smoking is what it is. It's just like, hey, I'm trying to calm my nerves. They're getting some benefit out of it that, at least in this moment, outweighs the potential risk to their life, right? And so if you just go in and say, well, you just need to stop smoking. You just need to stop smoking, put cigarettes away, whatever like that. I'm not going to hear you. Not going to hear you, because there's some interference or something else that they're getting. And the book Immunity Change really gets into understanding what are those hidden competing commitments that we're filling with this thing, like the nail in the head, had some purpose. She couldn't see that it was the problem and really preventing her from having a better life. So just another interesting concept or model.
What would you say is the best way to kind of navigate those situations? Would it be more coaching or?
Yeah, well, I do think intentional reflection. The cool thing about the Immunity to Change book is they have a process called an immunity map. They walk you through how to create a map that helps you understand why your foot's on the gas and the brake at the same time. And I do think coaching plays a huge role in that, because there's so often that we can't even see the thing that's most needed for us to see. And a good coach doesn't just come in and say, you got a nail in your head.
Exactly.
A good coach is going to start asking a lot of questions so that you come to some of that realization yourself. Because until you do that, it's not your solution.
Yeah, we've done another podcast on the difference between coaching and mentorship.
Yeah.
But we actually have a few courses that we kind of take a deeper dive into coaching, right, Lorraine? I mean, we have purpose-driven leadership training, but then also developing coaching leaders, which I've taken both. They're fantastic courses. Maybe talk a little bit more about the effects of, being a coaching leader, and what does that mean?
Yeah, and I'll tie it to what we're talking about too. Is a lot of times when I just ask in class in general, the number one thing that kind of pops up is I don't even know how to start having these conversations. That's why I just love the SBI. It gives an immediate tool. And hopefully it'll go well. But there's times where it can go this way. And so coaching may need to be that intervention. But I think what we're trying to do is, how do you have these challenging conversations around performance? How do you have these challenging conversations around behaviors? How do you have these challenging conversations around maybe when you have to let somebody go? How do I do it? Still using that tool and getting them a little bit out of their head. And like you said, Nate, and we know this as a coach, you don't have to figure out the solution. You are just really being with them as they think about traveling through different lenses through those questions. So really, really learning to get out of being an advice monster, which one of the books that we use that I absolutely love is called The Coaching Habit. Wonderful book about just realizing that desire to want to just give the answer. And of course you're going to take it. And then when somebody doesn't take it right away, what do? We speak a little bit louder with the information, because if we think we speak louder, of course then they'll hear it, right? And it doesn't work. And people say all the time in classes, like, no matter how many times I tell them, they don't do it. I'm like, well, then how about we think about it a different way, right?
Another approach might be needed.
That's right.
I remember learning that lesson in the course, and I remember us having a conversation. It doesn't just apply to workplace scenarios. Even with my children, where it's constantly raising my voice, like, do this, do this. But just like reframing it.
Right.
Like how am I actually asking that conversation, asking those questions?
Well, and I always, and you probably can relate this, is I always think about it as like giving them the ball. Through your question, you're giving them the ball. They're holding that ball, and they've got to make a decision what they need to do. You can't hang on to the ball and expect them to know how to dribble or throw it and hit the target. You've got to give them the ball. They've got to practice. They've got to think it through. And so
I think this is so interesting, how helpful coaching skills, active listening, open questions can really be for navigating difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Yes, sometimes, like we started out with SBI, sometimes you have to just put it out there and create awareness.
Right.
Okay, now I've created awareness. That's like part of the equation. You would love to think, oh, they now know, that means they're going to change. They're not going to do it again or whatever. Well, maybe, but oftentimes you're going to have more discussions and conversations. I'm thinking specifically of manager with direct report. Now you move into the coaching conversations and dialogue and discussion. They're aware, but they may not know what to do, or they may not know how to handle the situation better. So now you've got a different skill that you need to lean into. SBI is awesome for creating awareness.
Oh, so with SBI, would you say it's does it apply to conversations or difficult conversations that aren't necessarily situationally based? So let's say an employee is nervous or scared to have a difficult conversation with their employer about salary renegotiation. That's not necessarily situationally based, but they may not know how to approach that conversation. Would the model still work?
Yeah, so I would say in that case, it probably isn't the right framework. But I will say having that conversation requires preparation and planning. And so you should start to think about, how am I going to frame this up? You should have a sounding board, a mentor, someone else that can help you think about what you're going to say.
Practice.
And practice it. Don't just, do it off the cuff in the last 5 minutes of your one-on-one.
It reminds me of a rom-com of a guy saying in the mirror 80 times, "Can I call you?"
Exactly.
Yeah.
So be thoughtful and prepare, because you're right. There are difficult conversations that are not necessarily feedback based. Like, I observed some behavioral issue.
Right.
A lot of them are. Maybe 90% of them are. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. But if you're navigating another difficult conversation, I think the principles are still the same, in the sense that you need to practice, you need to script it out, you need to get trusted advisors who have your best interest in mind to give you some feedback on how to have that discussion.
What was the name of the book again that you were just referencing about from the Harvard?
Yeah, Immunity to Change.
Yeah, Immunity to Change.
Keegan and Leahy.
Yeah, so even in that example, if like that you brought up, Nic, where I'm nervous about having to have this conversation around performance management or whatever, I know I need to have it, but there's some interference, right? It's either I'm afraid or I'm putting too much effort into how are they going to take it, right? So that's that interference, right? So in coaching, being able to work through some of those interferences can really move us then to the action steps. Like you said, SBI kind of starts the awareness, and now we got to get to that piece where it's like, yeah, what action steps are you going to take? And which really starts to involve personal accountability through ownership and responsibility.
Yeah. At the end of the day, if you give them the answer, they go and do it and it doesn't work, who's responsible?
Yeah.
And who are they going to blame? You walk them through a decision-making process and coach them, and they come up with the answer, and then they go and do it and it doesn't work. Where's the accountability?
Yeah.
And chances of them doing exactly the way you told them to do it are fairly low if you're leaning too much into that direction. Right. So it is about helping them overcome that interference and identify their path forward. That's where coaching skills can really be helpful.
Yeah.
That's great. We're going to start to land this plane, as I like to say. But one of the other questions that we received, I think we all found it kind of interesting, was one about memory health.
Okay.
And I thought your response was interesting in that as well. Let's just say that you have an employer who is, starting to have some memory issues, and it is creating a negative or a toxic environment within the organization. And maybe you've had this conversation before. Maybe you've had it several times with them. What would you say is your best path forward?
I'm so glad you're answering this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think one of the things that we would highlight is, medical conditions or issues have a lot of sensitivity around them.
Yeah.
And so you have to be mindful of that as a potential reality. You need to make the right people aware that this is happening. Human resources is obviously a good place to start. They can provide a lot of really great guidance on what you should be doing. And the other thing is documentation is helpful. Getting it in writing, and then having some sort of way to acknowledge that they received it in writing can be really helpful.
Yeah, so it goes back to them. It's
That's
not
right.
just documenting in their file.
Correct.
But
They're signing, yes, I agree, and whatnot. So there's some ways that you should really help ensure that you're covering your bases, as it were. But you could be dipping your toe into some really challenging, very sensitive issues that you're probably going to need to pull other people in to help with.
So you're saying I should put a GoPro on my chest?
No, definitely not. Definitely, yeah, like the police officers have or whatever.
Yeah.
No, but you should, if possible, get them to acknowledge it in writing. I think that's a good step. And then, potentially if it continues, making sure the right people are aware of it is important.
And, honestly, Nate, just saying that, that's not even a bad idea to, after a feedback
any of those
conversation, to go,
conversations,
hey, Nic, thank you for spending this time, just to kind of capture what we talked about. Here were some bullet points. Here's kind of what I'm going to do. Here's what I heard you were going to do. And I think that builds trust and consistency. And
Are you talking about getting it in writing?
well, if I sent you a follow-up email, maybe I had to give you feedback or you had to give me feedback, just brief, hey, just capturing what we discussed, making sure that we're on the same page and just really solidifying that clarity, I think is so important. I love George Bernard Shaw's mantra that we have in our training room. The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it happened. And no, you said that. No, and we go back and forth and I'm like, no, I don't think I said that. And you're like, no, I absolutely remember that you said that.
Yeah.
This way you could easily come back and go, well, I disagree with point 2. And at least we have that.
Yeah. It's a good way to kind of make sure that there is clarity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Would you say that there's a defining line of when that might not be appropriate or it might be overkill? Let's say someone says, hey, I just want to give you a little feedback on this instance, and it's not a huge thing. It might be a huge thing to them, but it's not a huge thing in retrospect. Do you feel like I'm going to email you this now?
Oh,
It might be a little bit
Yeah,
too
it's
much.
probably a judgment call.
Yeah.
Depending, I think especially if it's a pattern,
Yes.
you're likely going to be asked to document anyway
Yes.
at some point. So I think having that, if it's more of a repetitive thing, is a good chance or a good opportunity maybe to really lean into that.
Yeah.
But still a bit of a judgment call. Like, does this rise to that level?
yeah, I think that's a good point. If you've got somebody where you're constantly having to go back and forth, and it's like, wow, like what you said, circling the drain, that would make a lot more sense.
That's good. Well, this was not a difficult conversation to have.
Oh,
Yeah, it was
that's
fun.
fine. Yeah.
All right. Do you have any final takeaways?
Takeaways. I think, how about if I say how about some giveaways?
Some giveaways.
Yeah, giveaways to just really do some thinking about the SBI. Be patient, listen to understand, and not to speak. I think would be a couple things that I would really try to just ground yourself in.
That's good. What do you think, Nathan?
Boy, I'm at the risk of sounding like a broken record. We know what that means, right? Broken record. We all know what that means. Skip.
A list of people at this table do.
Yeah, exactly. So prepare.
Yeah.
Prepare, plan, and practice.
Yeah.
Is so important, especially the more emotionally charged you think the situation could be. Be very intentional with that. I think is going to get you probably 90% of the way. Whether you use SBI or some other approach, practice.
Yeah.
I like that. I'd say mine is to invest in coaching for your leaders, invest in the training.
Yeah, that's good.
Even invest in how to understand someone's nonverbal cues,
very
when it comes to communication. But make it a priority to invest in, especially coaching training for your leaders and conversation training. I know we have a lot of those options at Frontline Training Solutions, and we'd like to talk to you more. So if this is something that you are dealing with, or someone in your organization is dealing with, or you just want to help prepare your leaders and team for success in the future, we want to help you get there. So we want to have this conversation with you, and it won't be difficult. It will be an easy conversation.
We're easy.
But we want to help you, and we want to help you get there with success, with whatever challenge you might be experiencing in your organization. So thank you so much for joining us here on the Frontline. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.